Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Taljaard. I'm a biostatistician and senior scientist in the clinical epidemiology program at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute in Ottawa, Canada. And I'm delighted to be a part of this workshop with my highly esteemed colleagues who are all true experts in pragmatic trials. And what I want to do is present some results from a methodological review in which we looked at a sample of trials that are explicitly labeled as pragmatic to determine whether and how authors defend or justify claims that the trial is pragmatic. I've actually previously presented a similar talk at the Society for Clinical Trials conference, so my apologies if this is somewhat familiar to some of you. So I'll start with a diagram that just tries to convey the rising interest in pragmatic trials in recent years. So this shows the total number of PubMed citations using the words pragmatic and trial in the title or abstract. And also among those, the actual trial publications using those terms. And so, for example, in 2019 alone, there were close to 1,300 articles published using these terms, of which about 600 were reports of actual trials. But the number of trials labeled as pragmatic is still only a small fraction of all randomized controlled trials. For example, in the same year, there were over 25,000 randomized controlled trials published. And so we can estimate that about 2% only of all RCTs are clearly labeled as pragmatic. So this gap is undesirable, according to this paper by Merrick and Sean, because both patients and clinicians recognize the need for more pragmatic trials. And similarly, government funders across the world are demanding more pragmatic trials, including in the US and in Canada. So consequently, pragmatic has become a desirable label in grant applications and in trial reports, but there is no explicit requirement, for example, in the consort extension to pragmatic trials, to justify the use of this label, for example, by referring to specific attributes or aspects of the trial that make it pragmatic. So one way in which one might be able to justify this label is to upload a completed précis diagram that explains how or in which ways this trial was designed to be pragmatic. So these 9 précis domains, which you are now well familiar with, are probably the most recognizable attributes associated with pragmatism. But there are also some other related trial attributes associated with pragmatism. For example, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, in the US refers to the use of routinely collected data and large sample sizes as being characteristic features of pragmatic trials. And the Canadian Institutes of Health Research refers to patient-oriented research and collaboration with various stakeholders and methods that can reduce the cost of conducting trials as being some features associated with pragmatic trial designs. And similarly, the NIH Collaboratory in the US characterizes pragmatic trials, amongst others, as being designed with input from health system stakeholders and having data collected through electronic health records. So our objectives then were to review a sample of trials that call themselves pragmatic and describe the types of trials, first of all, based on some objective trial characteristics. And then to examine whether and how these authors justify or defend claims that their trial is pragmatic. So we were specifically interested in what trial design features they use to defend a claim of pragmatism. We used our previously published electronic search filter to identify primary trial reports that are more likely to be pragmatic. These were published between 2014 and 2019. And for convenience, we focused on the subset registered in clinicaltrials.gov because we wanted to download some trial features from ct.gov. And we also focused in on those that use the word pragmatic anywhere in the text to refer to their trial design. So we manually extracted some trial characteristics from the trial report and also downloaded from ct.gov. We identified all occurrences of the word pragmatic, and we inspected the surrounding text for relevant statements that seem to support claims of pragmatism. We classified these design features that were apparently used to support a claim that the trial is pragmatic into any one of the 9 PRAGMATIC domains, but we also classified those that didn't clearly belong in a PRAGMATIC domain in any of the following categories. First, the type of trial design, for example, the use of cluster randomization as a kind of a justification that the trial was more pragmatic. The type of intervention or comparator, for example, saying that they used a usual care control. The absence of placebo or blinding, for example, some statements like, we did not blind participants in keeping with our pragmatic design. The approach to recruitment. For example, some authors referred to the use of waivers of consent, making the trial more pragmatic. And then some other categories like engagement with patients or other stakeholders, the use of routinely collected data, cost efficiency, and large sample sizes. And we also noted if there was just some vague reference to generalizability without an explicit link to a specific trial attributes associated with that claim. So after implementing our electronic search filter, we had a database of over 4,000 primary trial reports, of which about half were registered in ct.gov. And in that subset, we identified 415 or 21% that used the word pragmatic somewhere in the report to describe their trial. So that is the denominator for our review. Our first objective was to characterize the objective trial features. So these trial characteristics that we could identify. Maybe most interesting, 3/4 were multi-center trials, a smaller percentage were single-center trials. The median trial size was approximately 500 participants. The vast majority indicated that participants and providers were unblinded. More than half used patient-reported primary or secondary outcomes. Just over a third used cluster randomization. About 20% used exclusively routinely collected data for outcome assessment. Less than 1 in 10 explicitly reported patient or public involvement. Very few used an existing cohort or registry for recruitment, and only 4% referred to the interventions as minimal risk, which is quite interesting given that there is an increasing perception that pragmatic trials should be able to be conducted with waivers of consent. So objective 2 was to determine whether and how authors justify their claims of pragmatism. And so we found that 3/4 did justify their claims of pragmatism in some way, but about 1/4 provided no justification for the claim of pragmatism at all. They simply referred to their trial as being pragmatic without really explaining why they thought their trial was pragmatic or in which way it was pragmatic. So they left it up to the reader to believe that this trial was pragmatic. Among the 302 trials that did provide some sort of justification, the most common trial design features linked to pragmatism were one or more of the PRAGMATIC domains. So that is definitely not surprising. So 80% of the trials called on PRAGMATIC, one or more of the PRAGMATIC 2 domains to justify why they called their trial pragmatic. But there were also some of these non-PRAGMATIC domains that were used. For example, 16% referred to the type of intervention or comparator as supporting a pragmatic claim. 7% each referred to the use of routinely collected data, cluster randomization, and waivers of consent as justifying a claim that their trial was pragmatic, and 6% each referred to the absence of placebo or blinding and large sample sizes. About 13% just had a vague statement about generalizability without linking it to a particular trial design feature. We also drilled down on the trials that did call on PRAC to look at which specific PRAC domains were used. And the most commonly used PRAC domains were eligibility, organization, setting, and flexibility of delivery. So the other domains were less frequently used, but there was a good use across all of the domains. There were a few cases where it was clear that they were using a PRAC domain, but it was more difficult to clearly classify that into a particular PRAC domain. We also counted how many PRAC domains were used, which was particularly interesting. So nearly half of the authors used PRAC, or nearly half of the authors who used PRAC referred to a single PRAC domain, just one PRAC domain. Very few authors used more than 3 domains, in fact, to characterize pragmatism in their trial. We actually only found 9 authors who provided or cited a completed PRAC wheel for their trial. And actually, those were the ones that had very high scores within most of the domains. But in general, the tendency is to refer to a small number of domains. So in summary, many authors provided no justification for the claim of pragmatism, but 3/4 did provide 1 or more justifications by referring to 1 or more trial design features. The most frequent justifications, not surprisingly, drew on 1 or more of the PRAC-2 domains, and authors typically referenced only a limited number of domains. Other design features, for example, the use of routinely collected data, cluster randomization, and waivers of consent were also associated with pragmatism. So in conclusion, we have some recommendations. First of all, trialists should consider including a PRAC wheel or table to support claims that their trial is pragmatic, probably at the stage of grant application as well as at the stage of publishing the final report. Secondly, funders, researchers, clinicians, patients, and other trial stakeholders should develop a shared understanding of trial design choices that support decision-making. And we believe that PRAC-2 offers a basis for developing such a shared understanding. And finally, an update of PRAC-2 may be warranted in the next few years to incorporate some of these additional trial design features that our review demonstrated are relevant to pragmatism. So I just want to acknowledge all of my co-authors on this project, and thank you very much for your attention.